I don't have a map which I bought on the cheap from some London dealer, and I don't have some outrageously misleading French books about British espionage. I just have me, and I have no slides. So it's just going to be me talking to you. But actually, this follows on what I'm going to say from a lot of what James and others said in the last session. Because when we talk about Saudi Arabia, the history of Saudi Arabia, we are talking about agency. Sykes-Picot, by the way, I mean, nobody likes Mark Sykes, and he died anyway in the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1919, and nobody likes Pico either. So how many Saudi Arabias have there actually been? And we tend to think of the kingdom as a continuum. And until recently, I think it was very difficult for anybody who hadn't lived in Saudi Arabia, and indeed for many people who had, to conceptualize the nature of the contemporary Saudi state. We thought it was a succession of elderly monarchs who all seemed to support a dispensation anchored in a form of rigorous Islam that claimed ancestral validation and seemed both alien, certainly in the West, and eternal. But one of the consequences of the change in management that transpired in early 2015 is that this now seems an entirely inadequate way of thinking about the Saudi state. And that is partly because Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself has sought to mark a rupture in the nature of that state by claiming that he is in fact restoring a lost, ruptured, normative state. In particular, he has claimed that Saudi Arabia was different in the fairly recent past, essentially before the assault by Juhayman al-Otaiba and his gang of millenarian misfits on the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979. He's claimed that he wants the restoration of quote-unquote true Islam, and he's used this claim to construct a very different sort of legitimacy to that of his immediate predecessors. Now, the standard account of the emergence of the Saudi state as a distinct entity places it in the early to mid 18th century. And the date matters. For as long as anyone can remember, the foundational moment was said to have been in 1744, when the then emir of Diriyah, which is was a small oasis town in Najd, which is the central plateau of Saudi Arabia, another Mohammed bin Saud, joined forces with a notable, itinerant, and I think probably extremely annoying imam, Mohammed ibn Abdul Wahhab, to create an Islamically legitimized center of temporal power which could expand its influence in both temporal and religious terms across the peninsula. And there's a whole debate about why exactly this happened. There are problems with this narrative, of course. It was later said that Abdul Wahhab followed the Hanbali school of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence, which is the most austere and actually, until about the 1960s, the smallest of the four classical schools of Sunni jurisprudence, and had studied in Basra in southern Iraq and even Baghdad. But he denounced much classical jurisprudence and promoted the Quran and the Hadith, which are the basic prophetic texts, alone as sources of guidance. And it's unclear whether this and the stories about Baghdad and Basra are anything more than a later attempt to inscribe him into a comprehensible and respectable Islamic jurisprudential lineage in order to defend him against claims that he was simply a persuasive local preacher with a powerful personality. And indeed that his alliance with the Emir Mohammed was because his teaching provided a convenient sanction for the tribal raiding and predation on which the first Saudi state depended for survival. It's also characteristic of the traditional Saudi account of this period to emphasize the chaotic nature of the peninsula before the El Saud and El Sheikh, so the two families, the families of Mohammed ibn Saud and Mohammed ibn Abdul Wahhab. Before the Saud stepped in together with the Imam to remedy matters and produce, as it were, ex nihilo, order and stability. The period up until 1744, it was implied, was analogous in many ways to the Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance, turmoil, and oppression that preceded the Islamic revelation and its subsequent ascendancy in the early 7th century. But there was clearly more going on in and around the peninsula than the later Saudi publicists were prepared to admit. At the same time as the Emirate of Diriyah was converting itself to the revivalist Emirate of Najd, and eventually also the Hijaz, so where Jeddah is now and Mecca and Medina, other related Najdi tribal communities were in a very similar way establishing analogous political entities in both Kuwait and Bahrain. And Mohammed ibn Abdul Wahhab was also not the lonely reformer, or more precisely, as he was known in Saudi Arabia, the renewer, the mujaddid, which Saudi accounts often made him out to be. And again, the 18th century saw the rise of reformist movements elsewhere, particularly in North Africa, particularly with the austere Sufi revivalism of the Sanusiya in what is now Libya, and in Mughal India through the progenitor of the Ahl Hadith movement, Shah Wali Allah. Persia, just across the Gulf, in the 18th century saw the collapse of the Safavids, the rise of the remarkable Nader Shah, the emergence of the Qajar dynasty, and the displacement of the highly conservative Akhbari school of Shia jurisprudence by more dynamic Usuli mujtahids, who increasingly asserted a more prominent political role for themselves, which ultimately led to Khomeini. And the point is this: Saudi Arabia was never an exceptional or a lonely state, and the Al Saud were not unique. They emerged out of a historical juncture as much as any other state, family, or movement in the Arab, Ottoman, and Persian worlds. And this became more apparent in the latter part of the 18th century as the Emirate of Najd, through the inevitable logic of its predatory and expansionist nature and their maritime alliance with the aggressive Qawasim rulers of what are now Ras Al Khaimah and Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, came into conflict with the British in India, and through their repeated assaults on the great Shia shrine cities of Najaf and Karbala with the Ottomans. This actually is an example of sectarian, highly sectarianized Shia-Sunni conflict. The result was partly an Ottoman attempt to show up their influence in parts of the Red Sea and the Northern Gulf, and the establishment of a Pax Britannica, a maritime Pax Britannica, facilitated throughout the 19th century by Persian weakness, which restricted the expansion of Saudi influence into the lower Gulf, which is a sore point to this day. And it ultimately prevented the Arab Gulf states being swallowed up by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Iran in the 20th century. Perhaps more importantly, it led to the destruction by the Ottomans of the first and the rise of a second Saudi state, which was a revived but very limited emirate centered this time on Riyadh, but riven with family feuds and intensely suspicious of outsiders. Hence you get the doctrine, the familiar doctrine, the Saudi doctrine, al-wala wal-barra, which is loyalty to your ruler and your co-religionists and exclusion of others. This state collapses under its own contradictions after around 1870 and was replaced by the suzerainty of the preeminent sheikhs of the powerful Shamar tribal federation, the Rashid. And this was a backdrop for the famously daring raid on Riyadh in 1902 by the young and powerfully built Abdulaziz bin Abdurrahman Al Saud, later popularly known as Ibn Saud, where he killed the Rashid governor, seized the city, claimed the rule of Najd again for his family, and eventually, after the sack of Ha'il and Ta'if, destroyed Rashid power forever, seized the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina, cleansed them of innovations such as the tombs of the Prophet and his companions, and next to the Hijaz, expelled the Hashemites, and in 1932 proclaimed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And if that's not agency, I don't know what is. Abdulaziz exemplifies the remarkable ability of the family to learn from their mistakes. He established a dynastic system that sought to minimize the possibility of intra-family conflict that had brought down the second Saudi state, at least as long as the first generation of his sons lasted. And unlike the first Saudi state, he established a modus vivendi with his neighbors, mediated by the British, who shaped much of the modern Middle East state system, certainly in the Levant, after the 1921 Cairo Conference, and facilitated border agreements with the Hashemite rulers and brothers, who have been mentioned already by James, Faisal of Iraq and Abdullah of Transjordan, both potentially fierce rivals of Abdulaziz because of their ancestry, but both equally in need of stability in order to establish their own rule in what for them, after all, in many ways was alien territory. And there's a further element in this. Abdulaziz had defeated all his rivals with the aid of exactly the same sort of religiously committed tribal levies that had enabled the first Saudi state to emerge. But a secret of the Al Saud is that they are not themselves tribally affiliated or partisan. They say they belong to a tribal group called the Aneza. It's very doubtful they actually do. And it's precisely this lack of tribal commitment that probably enabled the Emir Mohammed in the 18th century to emerge as an effective arbiter of tribal conflict. And it was that which had, in the end, crippled the Rashid, who were tribally committed, and enabled Abdulaziz to mobilize their tribal enemies, safe in the knowledge that he would not thereby privilege other tribal groups. And this enabled Abdulaziz in 1927 to mobilize the settled town and village communities, so Hadar, not Bedu, of Najd, the Jawf, and Tabuk to crush the very tribal levies he had relied upon, but which had rebelled against his efforts to create a territorially bounded state which lived at peace with its neighbors and operated as a state within an emerging state system. A lesson, incidentally, for Ashara in Syria. And the discovery of oil in the late 1930s meant that Saudi Arabia never again needed to sustain itself by predation. And it's precisely this system, which for over a century has been the longest ever period of stable rule under the El Saud, which Mohammed bin Salman, who is to all intents and purposes the real ruler of the kingdom, is now seeking to adapt again into what is actually a fourth Saudi state. And what is the nature of this state? First of all, Mohammed bin Salman has discarded or remodeled the three traditional pillars of Saudi rule: the family, the tribes, and the religious scholars, the ulema. When Crown Prince Faisal deposed King Saud in the early 1960s, he did so with the help of several of his most powerful half-brothers, including Fahd, Naif, Sultan, and Mohammed. These independent second-generation princes do not exist anymore. Mohammed bin Salman has instead replaced them with younger princes, often from collateral or cadet branches, who owe their positions entirely to him, not to their own standing. And he's removed, in various ways, as we all know, wealth from others. Secondly, Saudi Arabia is now about 90% urban. Tribal identity remains important as a signifier of social position for purposes of marriage alliances and unelective affinities. But tribes are no longer independent centers of loyalty or potential centers of opposition. Instead, with the development of a patrimonial model of wealth production and distribution monopolized by a highly centralized state, its extractive arm in Aramco and now its commissioning arm in the Public Investment Fund, they have become dependent on a complex system of highly hierarchical patronage. Third, and perhaps most extraordinarily, Mohammed bin Salman has done what many observers thought was impossible: subdue the opposition of conservative religious scholars, particularly to the rapid social change he sees as essential to his program. There is a long and complex history associated with the relationship between the two, as we've seen. A key moment was the rise in the 1980s of what became known as the Sahwa al-Islamiyya, the revivalist movement of often non-establishment religious scholars who expressed opposition to aspects of rule by the El Saud and demanded a greater say in governance. This was partly the product of the greater influence already given to the established ulema in the aftermath of Juhayman's uprising. It was also the result of the immense sums of money poured into the promotion of Salafist religious education, both within the kingdom and outside it, something that did enormous damage but created a huge class of surplus clerics. Already under King Abdullah, Salman's predecessor, there was an attempt to rein in their influence, not least because it was associated with the rise in political activism among both Sunni and Shia Islamist activists, which senior members of the family regarded as seditious. But it's Mohammed bin Salman who has grasped the nettle, and he's done so in three distinct ways. First, by intimidation, locking up key Saudi sheikhs such as Salman al-Auda, the John Locke of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed al-Arifi, and Ayad al-Qarni, all associated in various ways with the Muslim Brotherhood, as indeed was Jamal Khashoggi, whom I knew and others here will have known. Second, by cracking down on social media and other ways in which radical clerics connected direct with the Saudi public. And thirdly, most importantly, by social liberalization, which has released a surge of support for him among the majority young population of the kingdom. All this represents a radical rupture with the past. Mohammed bin Salman might say he's simply restoring the ancient constitution, as English secretaries of the 17th century said, and that the clerical understanding of Islam after 1979 was seriously deformed by excessive power. But this is the first time since Abdulaziz, that a ruler of Saudi Arabia, has decided that he alone makes the rules. And this has persuaded a large section of the population, perhaps the majority, to back him. There are challenges. If it isn't religious sanction that gives him legitimacy, there will need to be economic and developmental success, the same model that many other states across the region have struggled with that takes its place. That's the point of Vision 2030. There are also regional challenges. Mohammed bin Salman needs regional peace for economic reform to work. What has happened in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and now, of course, Iran, reminds us that that is not a given. He also needs oil to be priced well over the longer term and well above $65 a barrel. But for the moment, we're witnessing the emergence of a much younger, more dynamic, more agile, and more pragmatic polity in the Arabian Peninsula than we have seen in our lifetimes, and that is remarkable. And that is why Mohammed bin Salman has decreed that the real foundational date of the kingdom is not 1744, but 1727, when the Emir Mohammed first established his rule in Diriyah, but this time without Mohammed ibn Abdul Wahhab. Bang on time.
Well, you even have 30 seconds left.
It's 30 seconds. No, get an extra 30 seconds.
Mohammed bin Salman seems to control the day, really. But what threats are there against him?
You know, the issue of the ulema. I mean, I have been astonished that there has not really been opposition. I mean, there's been the occasional person on social media, clerical religious scholar, saying, this is un-Islamic, this is terrible, blah, 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 blah. But by and large, there's been nothing. Are they all... Does it exist? Or are they in hiding? I mean, it's a question I ask Saudi friends. I mean, it's not clear to me. I mean, Nelly and Ronnie may know more about it. The biggest threat is that Vision 2030 doesn't work. That you end up not creating enough jobs and a strong private sector, because that's the point of Vision 2030.
Yeah.
So the social stuff is great. I mean, having three, being able to go out a weekend and have every week have choice between a monster truck demolition derby, a Metallica concert somewhere in the desert and some other stuff, none of which I go to, but, and Saudis go to these things and love them. And that's great. But that's not a long-term strategy. That's an essential building block of something that's much longer. So I think the dangers are, in a way, in his own ambitions.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much.